is Professor Carlo Granados. So he's going to be delivering a talk titled Six Criteria for Becoming a Critical Intercultural Teacher. So I just want to read a couple of lines about his biodata. He holds a PhD in education from Universidad Santo Tomás and an MA in British Cultural Studies, an ELT from the University of Warwick, and an MA in Applied Linguistics to TEFL from Universidad Distrital in Bogotá. So right now he's the academic vice chancellor at Institución Universitaria Colomboamericana, UNICA, and he's done extensive research in intercultural communication, and also he has been a guest professor in different universities in Colombia at the master's and even doctoral level. He is actually one of the professors of our program here. And so he's got different interests such as teacher education, cultural studies, interculturality, of course. And he's been working in the last couple of years on the colonial thoughts, among others. So I would like to welcome Dr. Granados, and again, express my gratitude for accepting this invitation to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to thank all the organizers of the event. So I will start sharing my screen first to see if you can see it. Okay, is that all right? Let me know if you are seeing it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, all right, perfect. And I want to say that I envy
Entonces
you
quiero decir que los envidio porque yo estoy en Bogotá y está lloviendo mucho.
today, and I guess you are warm there. But okay, let's start then. So the title of the presentation, as Jose was mentioning, is entitled Six Criteria for Becoming a Critical Intercultural Teacher, and it's part of the research I did for my doctoral program. Probably, well, people who have been here or some other, or if you have heard me in other events, probably you have listened to me talking about the pedagogical intervention, or what I did in classes, like to incorporate a vision of interculturality that was critical in the classes of language, culture, and identity, or in the classes of intercultural communication or pedagogy and second language. This that I'm going to share with you today is another part of the research that was more the result of the whole process and of analyzing the information that I obtained from different sources. Then I will explain that in more detail. So I will give you a brief introduction of what the perspective is and what the project sort of was about. Then I will focus on colonial traces in the teaching of English as a foreign language here in Colombia. And then I will move to the criteria for becoming a critical intercultural teacher. The criteria were formulated for licenciatura students, like the ones who are going to be future language teachers. But that doesn't mean that the criteria do not apply to any teacher in any other context. Probably some of you will already incorporated certain things into your professional academic life. Probably there are some other things that you could explore after this talk. So my project is connected, and the research that I developed was connected particularly to teacher education, because that's one of my interests, and in special initial teacher education, because I work with future teachers, as I was saying before. When doing the project and constructing the problem, what struck me from the analysis of the documents and what I have read was the academic colonialism present in the teaching of English as a foreign language. And also how we were incorporating culture in the teaching of English. Because, well, many of us probably come from the tradition of um, the subjects of North American civilization and history, or British civilization and history, or if we are working in service courses, English for other departments, we usually talk about culture, but in a very superficial way, like foods, festivals, folklore, how do people live in those countries, what are their landmarks, but we don't see culture like in a more profound way, and probably in how culture is a place of a struggle between different groups and a fight for recognition or a fight for the vindication of identities, etc., etc. And to start the project, or not to start the project, during the project, I found some dichotomies or some tensions in the teaching of English as a foreign language. And of course, they have been seen by other scholars, Colombian scholars, foreign scholars in their context as well. But after finding or arriving at those tensions, my idea was how could I somehow interrupt or disrupt those tensions? And that's where the criteria come from. So this that I'm going to show you here are the tensions that many authors have found and that I also found in what I was reading and analyzing. And they are permeated, or they underscore those colonial traces in the teaching of English as a foreign language. So the first one is whether we consider um, the job or our work as English teachers belonging to an instruction process or as a profession. Most of the times we hear in some cases that enseñar es un oficio, but is that really un oficio or is that a profession? So when finding or when analyzing this dichotomy or this tension, what we find is that most of the times English teachers are considered instructors that are trained to follow procedures, and the procedures work in the same way for all the contexts. And also that we need to be knowledgeable of English as a language and of the teaching methodologies for English. How do we teach English as a foreign language? With which methods? But bearing in mind what we really do, our work goes beyond instruction, and many scholars working in education and in language teaching talk about the professionalization of the uh, of English language teaching, meaning that we do more than following procedures and that learning methodologies, and that we need to know or we need to have some other knowledges, and that also we need to be certain about when to modify or when to adjust the procedures according to the needs of the context and the needs of our students. So that's the first tension that I found with a colonial trace, because here is more focusing on the instrumental nature of the job. The other one, which has been very frequently critiqued, has to do with, of course, some authors, for example, Adriana Gonzalez and some others, Yurda would name it like, who is a better teacher, a native English speaker or a non-native English speaker? But that has implications, because here, uh, based on the language policy, the bilingual plan, native English speakers were favored, and most of the times they were hired without having um, a degree in pedagogy, right? They were proficient English speakers because it's their mother tongue, but they do not necessarily need to know how to teach. It also implies certain inequity because sometimes those native speakers are paid better than the local teachers who have the degree, and they are not required for additional certifications, while we as local teachers need to get more certifications and extra courses and proficiency exams, etc., etc. Also, many institutions use the native speaker, if we can call it that way, as a hook to sell, right? To sell the courses, to sell the programs, etc., etc. And additionally, the idea of that native speaker is racialized based on the fact that usually when the institutions look for the native speakers, they don't think about speakers from India or Jamaica or Trinidad or any other English-speaking country, but it's usually a blonde, white, American or British guy or girl that is going to teach English. So here there is an inequity and there is also an aspect of racialization. The other tension that I found was how English teachers are viewed and what it is expected from an ideal English teacher. Um, Most of the times, and probably you have seen the news in at many different moments, English teachers are considered poor. Like they don't know English, they don't know how to speak English, and they don't know how to teach it. And it's also shown like in a very generalized way. So we have here, for example, Colombia entre los últimos países de la región en bilingüismo. That's from 2020, but I'm sure there might be some news from 2022 showing the report of EF, English First, saying that we are still in the last countries being bilingual in English and Spanish, and that it is mostly due to the quality of the teachers. Also, sorry, uh, we have this one where an expert, Amador Watson, says that here we teach English in a very archaic way. And this one, that is 1971, says that we didn't know how to use the direct method. That was the one that was in fashion at that moment. So basically, there is a deficitarian view, and the ideal teacher is the one who knows English and who knows how to teach it, but not anything more beyond that. Okay. The other one, the other tension has to do with the instrumental functions of English versus the cognitive and intercultural functions. What that means is that when we teach English, we usually focus on, well, analyzing the policy. The goal of learning English is to become competitive in the markets and to make part of the global world and the global economy. Um, but there are some other functions of the language, especially when we talk about interculturality, that is how we get to know other cultures, other peoples, ourselves through the language, but that is not considered in the general aspects of the policy. We are focusing on teaching English for economic profit. We have that information in González. Adriana González has written a lot about that, and also Carmen Elena Guerrero. And that also is aligned with the idea that English is the key, that English is the solution to all the problems. But of course, that's a myth. The fact that you speak English does not necessarily mean that you are going to have a better job or a better economic situation or any improvement in your life. In some cases, it can be, but because you have some other conditions. So you have a degree or you have a cultural and economic capital so that English can become a key for success, but it's not always the case. And of course, given that primary or that importance to English diminishes the importance we would give to other languages, like Spanish or indigenous languages, Creole languages. So because English becomes the only goal when we talk about bilingualism. Also, another tension that I found when analyzing the teacher education is, especially English teacher education, has to do with the tension between disciplinary competencies and integrative competencies. So in some of the documents, they would focus a lot on English and on methodology. But if we think of teaching English as a profession, we will advocate for other kinds of knowledges. What we usually have in our PACE, Proyectos Educativos Institucionales, as formación integral. So it is not only the discipline, but the teacher needs to know about research, needs to know about a little bit of social linguistics, about the context, a little bit about psychology, now that we're moving into, or we are giving importance to social emotional factors. So we need some other elements that could be incorporated into uh, language teaching or in our education as teachers. And the final tension that I found was an emphasis on the practical knowledge versus an emphasis on the theoretical knowledge. Um, and it's connected again to the idea that we need to know only about English and about methodology. So the emphasis on the practical knowledge is like, for example, authors Mar and English talk about how many English teachers, not here in Colombia, but in other places, disregard the importance of linguistics as a knowledge base for teaching a language. They consider that what is important is just having the practical knowledge, having uh, or knowing the methodology, and only that. But for making informed decisions, and if we consider ourselves professionals, that those decisions and that practical knowledge is also or is mm, based on the theory, on what we have learned. And we learn the theory to, to better apply that practice in the contexts. It's not, then again, coming back to the first tension, to exercising or executing a recipe that is going to work in every context. That is the knowledge that we have about the methods can be adapted, modified, adjusted according to the needs of the context. But for doing that, we need to know theory. All right, so those were the tensions that I found during that initial part of the project. So here I want to show you, well, I'll tell you a little bit of the methodology. I'm not going to go in depth in that part, but the project was framed as a critical ethnography. And in critical ethnography, you are like embedded in the context as in unusual ethnography, but you want to take into consideration the issues of power in that context or in that phenomenon that you are analyzing. I followed Karspeken steps. I'm not going to go in depth in there, but in the steps included first, well, not first because they were not in a sequence. One of the elements was incorporating the notion of critical interculturality as proposed by Walsh 2010 in the licenciatura program. And I did it with 3 courses, language, culture and identity, intercultural communication, pedagogy and second language. So that was the practical part, because my concern was that critical interculturality, when I read all the documents, all the authors, it was very theoretical. And in my mind, I didn't know, or my concern was, how do I put this into practice? And another element that made part of the research was document analysis. So at that moment, I analyzed the coffee project. That was one of the first for licenciatura programs for improving quality in licenciatura programs. I analyzed the pay from my university, Única, and I also analyzed what different scholars have published in relation to teacher education and these tensions that I was mentioning to you before. And there were also some interviews with professors from licenciatura programs from Universidad de Antioquia, Universidad del Valle, Universidad de la Amazonía, someone from the teacher education department at the Ministry of Education, the bilingual plan, and well, basically those. So after collecting all that information, what I what my intention was in the after the research was, how do we incorporate, or how do we decolonize through critical interculturality the licenciatura programs. That was my idea. So for that, I decided to formulate the criteria based on what I had found. So these are the criteria that I proposed. They are also, well, they have been recently published in the special edition of ICALA, the special issue about decoloniality, the South writes back. So the first criteria is considering that graduates of initial language training programs are professionals in foreign language pedagogy. What this means is that we need to insist, well, at least the ones who are teacher educators as me, we have to insist on the fact that teaching English is a profession, and that for becoming professional, you need to have some certain knowledge. And besides that when you are a graduate from the program, you already have the information that you need to make informed decisions about bilingualism, about the teaching of English, about methodologies that are appropriate for the different contexts. And of course, this sounds very utopian, very ideal, but it also implies at some points uh, getting into conflict with sometimes people in charge, like authorities, because they believe that they know what it is language teaching, and they want to do certain things, but we as teachers and as language educators know that those things probably won't work, or that they need to be adapted. That's why I included this that I found from a post in Facebook. It seems like the key to being an education expert is just coming up with new names for things teachers are already doing. Most of the times, what happens in language teaching is that we are already doing certain things, but then there is a fashion, and the fashion has a new name. But when you analyze that fashion, it comes back to what you were taught at the university with a different name. Or probably it's just a little change in one of the things, but it's not like a whole new thing. So it is important to make language teachers and future language teachers aware that they have the knowledge to not become, let us say, enlightened. No, not, that is not the word. Like uh, uh, convinced by fashions that probably they already know, or that they are already doing, or because it's just in fashion without any pedagogical knowledge. That is what happened at some point with technology, for example, that many people were incorporating technology, but without really knowing or having a pedagogical basis for incorporating technology into language teaching. Now we have the theoretical basis and we know why we make certain things with technology, but before it wasn't that the case. The second criterion is graduates of initial language training programs, initial language education programs, are multilingual educated teachers. And this has to do with the fact that um, eh, we are Spanish speakers and English teachers, and not necessarily for working with English, we need to reject Spanish, right? Spanish is a resource that can help us learn English. Of course, we are not going to teach the English class in Spanish, but Spanish is a resource. And something that I included here, the poster for the symposium, because for example, with Professor Muriel Molinier and Professor Leonardo Peluso, and well, in all the moments that we were sharing, we were speaking several languages. We were speaking Spanish, we were speaking in French, we were speaking in English, and we understood each other. And when we didn't have the resource, we resorted to any of the languages we knew in common so that we could communicate. So not necessarily we need to reject the languages that we know. Actually, we need to take advantage of them. And another thing that we were discussing at some point with other colleagues is the fact, for example, that when you teach Spanish in the United States, the books for teaching Spanish to foreigners are written in English. The instructions are in English. Of course, it's a class for Spanish, but the instructions for the people to understand and to learn are in Spanish. So why here do we need to reject Spanish or to reject any other language that we know? We need to incorporate and to use them. And especially, for example, at Univaya Escuela de Lenguas, where we have all the languages there in the same place. And even Lengua de Señas, that is not common. I think it's probably one of the uh, first universities that has a sign language and that has probably indigenous languages in certain places. So that's the second criterion. The third criterion has to do is related to this. Graduates of initial training programs care about maintaining their quality as integral teachers. This is also related to the idea that we as teachers are language teachers, are professionals, and that we need to know about different disciplines and about different areas that are going to enrich what we do as teachers. And we also we always talk about formación integral, integral education. Well, that's what a teacher should be. And it also needs to do with the code of ethics for a teacher. I don't know if you're familiar with the codes of ethics that they have in the States or in Europe, and even here for the teachers at Distrito. There is a responsibility of the teacher with the students in the sense that they have to protect them, to keep them safe, etc., etc. But there is also a responsibility with the profession, maintaining the quality of the profession and ensuring that the people that exercise the profession is of good quality. And there is also an ethic with you as a professional of keeping updated with the topics that probably you need to reinforce or with other areas that you could consider that can enrich your classes. So we have now social emotional learning, that is an important issue. We have interculturality because we are embracing and affirming diversity in our contexts. And of course, that is related also to social sciences, geography, history. So we need to know a little bit of everything. I'm not saying that we become experts in all the areas, but that we enrich with other disciplines. I say that also because at some point, some of my students at the licenciatura program were focused only on the teaching of English, and that was the final goal. And of course, that's important, but it's not the only thing that they will need to know to, to be a good teacher in this current world. The fourth criterion has to do with how we conceive English. Well, I speak about English because I'm an English teacher, but it could be with French or with any other language. The foreign language is a means of recognizing oneself as diverse and also recognizing the diverse others. I mean, the learning of a language, or in this case, as I was speaking of English, is not necessarily for competitiveness or for becoming more successful economically. One of the concerns that, for example, rural teachers always have is how and why do I teach English in this context? Because the students, of course, they are not going to see the importance, right? So what many of the students or the teachers that, well, at some moment were students, but now they are teachers are doing, is to use English to uh, recover and affirm local identities through English. So I included this one here. I always speak about this project because I think it is a beautiful project that a professor in Boyacá did, Flor Ángela Hurtado. She did a project for recovering peasant practices in Santa Rosa de Viterbo, I think. And what she did was, through the class of English, she encouraged students to interview their their parents or their grandparents and to talk about the games, to talk about the customs, to talk about what they did when someone had a problem that was usually a convite, to meet and to help that person. And also, she recovered the practice of weaving, hilado, for Teruana. And that was a symbol of the recovery of those peasant practices. And she through English, she achieved that her students embraced and valued that culture that they somehow were losing because of different influences. And here I have another, well, this is a picture just to remind me. This is one that Professor Alexander Ramirez has done there at Univalle with the students also through English, and it's mapping the university for places that are the places that there are for people with difficult mobility or with certain disability. So it's something, I mean, English is not the end, but it's the means to learn about other identities, other people, other groups, and even about ourselves. The fifth criterion that I propose, and is related to what I was mentioning before, and of course, this takes time, is a bit more difficult, especially at university level, has to do with interdisciplinarity, considering interdisciplinarity as a decolonizing option. Most of the times, when we move disciplines or when we sometimes break the boundaries of what is considered our discipline, we are we enter into a conflict, or we are rejected, or we are questioned about why we are there. For example, when I started studying ciencias humanas, human sciences, I was the only English teacher, and the rest of the people were sociologists, anthropologists, and uh, literature, literature, like people specialized in literature. And there was always that question, like, what are you doing here? Like, you are an English teacher, you probably shouldn't be here. And it's an experience similar to some of my colleagues. But if we are working with language, if we are working with culture, um, eventually we will get, or we will become immersed in other disciplines. And it's a challenge, of course, because sometimes you don't have the background, or you don't know about the authors, but it is something that is very enriching and that could make classes more interesting, and probably it will encourage you or motivate you to do different things, right? So that's why interdisciplinarity could be a decolonizing option, and also to somehow break with the compartments, right? Because we tend to be, especially in academia, we tend to be very jealous for the places where we are. So it's how do we make, or how do we incorporate methodologies, theories from other disciplines to enrich what we are doing as language teachers. And the final one, the sixth criterion, has to do with um, the idea that practice, I mean, the fact that we need to know how to do things, the technical knowledge, the practice is valuable, but it is not the only element. We also need to know where that practice comes from and how it can be sustained or supported. And that implies not only theory and action, like theory and practice, but also the reflection, and also a critical praxis, or a critical practice, meaning that the as educators, not as instructors, as educators, we are trying as a goal to construct a better future. And we do that by educating the new generations. So again, I want to refer here to some projects from the professors at Univalle, from Hans. I forgot his last name. Oviedo, I think it is. He's doing a project in Florencia about the conservation of a wetland that is the school where he works is in the wetland. And the idea is to make students aware of the importance of the wetland, what it contributes to the environment, but also to make of them like educators for the other people that are not familiar with the wetland. So they also educate the community. And this is done again through English. It's not like English is forgotten and we are doing any other thing, or we are becoming geography teachers or biology teachers. No, it's a way to teach English in a way that is contextualized and that responds to a need that of the context. And the other one, the one here with the peace pigeon, that is by Catalina Jaramillo. She's doing a project in her school, Mariscal, and her school is in Medellin and is permeated by violence. Many of the kids in the school end up in gangs, and her concern was, how do I prevent that these students, these children and these youth get into the gangs? So she created a project around peace ambassadors, but also incorporating elements of history, like how what is the history of violence in the country, what is the history of violence in the city, in their locality, and how it affects the consequences for their families, for them, and how, uh, or to invite them to become peace ambassadors and to not follow the path of violence. So again, done through English and responding to a need of the context. So those are the criteria that I proposed. If you notice, they have to do with, well, professionalism, that's one. The other one has to do with considering English as a means, not as an end. And the other one, which probably we have heard many times in our language classes, is the importance of the context. But here is context seen in a wider scope, right? Like context in the locality, in the region, what the needs are, etc., etc. Not let us say, the artificial context that we create for teaching a language class. That is what we normally did in communicative language teaching, right? That we always have the situation of creating an artificial context for students to practice. Here, it's a context that is real. So, I think I'm good with the time. Okay. I'm going just to finish with this. That would be the conclusion. So, as I said, for me, the criteria imply using English as a means, not as an end. Also going against the deficit view of English teachers and encourage or make our students aware and language teachers aware that they are good quality educators and that they need to be good quality educators, that they have to work for that. The commitment with the profession, with the students, and with the colleagues, with the context, being knowledge producers. I know sometimes in the schools, for example, it's very difficult that teachers do that, but having a good leader and having the opportunity is a good choice. I can name here Professor Clara Inés Lozano from Colegio La Felicidad here in Bogotá, that is a public school, but it's a bilingual public school. And all the teachers do projects, and they invite teachers of the locality to show their projects in an internal symposium. And then in bigger symposiums like this one or like ASOCOPI, for example, so that they show their experiences, and it's not that like the associations are not only related to university teachers, but also to school teachers. And the final one, incorporating other disciplines into what we do. So this makes also part of my idea of how we can make or how can we become intercultural critical teachers. And thank you very much. I think I managed well with the time, I guess. And we'll have time for the questions, I guess. I will stop sharing so that I can show my face. So do we have any questions, any comments? Here, for example, I have Cesar Tenorio, who says, I design materials to teach some contents proposed by the men in the suggested curriculum in some courses. It integrates social studies, technology, and science, among others. That's right. It's the interdisciplinary or formación integral, or at the school level, cross curriculum.
Yes, Carlo, thank you very much for this very interesting and important presentation. We're going to open the floor for questions or comments by the audience, either on the other side of the screen or here in our auditorium. Yes, please.
Hello, Ms. Professor Granados.
Hello.
I am Anu Shastri from SUNY Oneonta, New York, State University of New York at Oneonta, New York. And I'm also in teacher education in the area of educational psychology. I was really very much impressed by the emphasis on contextualizing the pedagogy, because we are also experiencing this kind of a culture divide in our students. The students who want to become teachers, they are primarily from the white suburban middle class. And when we look at the the school population in our schools, public school settings, those are increasingly diverse. So one of the questions that constantly students struggle with is how can they be able to use pedagogical practices that are inclusive. So I would very much appreciate if you could share your thoughts on some of the things that students can do to facilitate this kind of inclusive pedagogy?
That's right. Thank you for the question. In fact, we were working with that in the workshops that we had, the face-to-face workshops, and I think that there are many, let us say, approaches that could be employed. It also depends on the context, the schools that they are, but one is culturally responsive teaching, right? Like when you in cultural responsive teaching, the first part, of course, that is going to sound very obvious, but it's getting to know your students. But getting to know your students means get to know their identities, who they come from, what are their histories, who are their families, and from there, trying to build a methodology that responds to them. The other one that we studied and that I consider could have this perspective is place-based pedagogies. So when, for example, what I was telling you about Boyacá here is in the center of Colombia, is a peasant community, a peasant region, and many of the teachers there work with the territory, what the territory provides, the landscape, the context, and sometimes they even integrate it with another one that is community-based pedagogies. So trying to bring the people that are around the students that also to educate them, let us say, or to make part of that teaching process, right? Probably interview them or learning about their experiences or what they did in the past that is not done now. So I think those are ways in which they could probably incorporate that. And of course, there is also the fact that if they are uh, white middle class, as you said, probably they will have to break the barrier first, right? Because sometimes students that come from different backgrounds, let us say that they are non-white or they are from other places, they tend to be like hesitant in how to interact with the teacher. And then there is that hierarchy. But if the teacher cares about knowing or about knowing them who they are, I think it could possibly work.
Thank you. We still have a couple of minutes for one more question. Yeah, we don't see any more comments on the chat.
No. Let's see. No, I don't see any other here.
Carlo, I know you, of course, you're placed in Bogota, and this research you conducted, you did it with students in your workplace. How much of these findings apply to other universities that also educate teachers in Bogota? Since I know you know pretty well the place.
Well, I think many of the universities, well, I would say especially public ones, follow this path, right? Like not necessarily in the same way I explained or that I proposed the criteria, but I think many are moving into a more integrative perspective of language teaching. I know, for example, from Universidad de Antioquia, Adriana González is working on English as an international language. So trying to dismantle the idea that you need to speak as a native speaker, then again, so-called native speaker from the United States or from Britain, and that accent is not something that is bad, that it actually makes part of your identity, and that also, in the case that you want to sound as a native speaker from a specific place, it is your choice, but it's not an obligation, right? So it's something that she's working there. I know also in other places they are working with literature to dismantle racial prejudice or sexual orientation prejudices or gender, let us say, gender stereotypes, let us say it this way.
Thank you. And there's one question by
From
Monica. Monica, could you
yes.
please activate your microphone?
Monica?
Yeah.
Yeah, but she's silenced. Go ahead.
Okay.
Well, while Monica opens her mic,
Yeah, there's a question on the chat.
I would like to know the role of different languages, local and foreign, in this intercultural approach. Well, in the then again, I'll speak from my context. We are a licenciatura in bilingual education. So there, and connected to the interculturality, the fact is that no language is given a higher status than the other, right? English and Spanish have the same goal, or the same role, let us say. And also, it implies that the use of Spanish, the use of Spanish is not seen as a bad practice. Of course, it depends on the semesters, but for example, in first and second semesters, uh, the use of Spanish is allowed. And I also did it because, for example, when in the class that I was mentioning, language, culture, and identity, that was in first and second semester. So having students discuss issues of race, issues of gender, issues of class in English was a bit difficult. So at some point, I allowed them to speak Spanish because it was related to critical thinking. And to show critical thinking is easier to do it in your mother tongue while you get the vocabulary, the structures, and all that to communicate that message in the foreign language. Also, again, speaking from my context, we have a class that is Colombia Indígena. And in that class, we always, I mean, the professor in charge of that also gives a lot of importance to indigenous languages and how indigenous languages are spoken in the territory and how they are not dialects, but they are a language, and how they make part also of what could be considered being bilingual. Not necessarily bilingualism means Spanish and English. It could be Spanish and Criollo Sanandresano, Spanish and Palenquero, Spanish and Romani, Spanish and an indigenous language.
Yeah, okay. So with this comment, we conclude this presentation. I would like to again thank Professor Carlo Granados for this wonderful presentation and also the audience.
Thank you, Jose.
And we'll move on to our next presentation. Just wanted to ask here the audience to give a round of applause to our speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the interpreters. Thank you.
Right,
Thank
yes.
you, Shirley.
Also,
Thank you,
Shirley
Alexander.
and the other colleague. All right, so we will
And
move
there
on
was
to
another